Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Instead of making a flashy text effect, today we'll be dealing with pivot points. Pivot points are essential for rotating or scaling text. They sometimes can make or break how the text animation look. However, the current way geometry nodes handle text pivot is not flexible and leaves a lot to be desired. I made a node group to resolve the inconveniences current pivot points have, and I use them on a regular basis. It's not a text effect tutorial per se, but it's quite a useful tool, so I recommend you to make it as well. Alright, let's get into it. Before we jump into geometry nodes, let's start with problem definition. I have two main issues with the current way pivot points are implemented. Just to clarify though, this is because I'm trying to utilize text in Blender above and beyond what the developers intended, and more likely it is not an issue in regular scope of usage. So, it's not like it's a shortcoming of developers. I have nothing but gratitude for those guys. First issue is, we only are able to define one pivot point per strings to curve node. To demonstrate, I have this simple setup. When we run this animation, text will scale up to a certain position, then rotate once on z-axis, and exit out of the scene by scaling down to 0. So if we say set this rotation pivot point to midpoint by connecting these sockets, we end up with a compactor rotation with completely different motion. The issue arises if we want to say set the pivot point to bottom right for the second scale. We cannot use the provided pivot point because it is already used up. If I change the pivot point to bottom right, it will affect the rotation animation. So this is inconvenient. There is a way to circumvent this issue by keyframing the pivot point. However, doing so breaks the procedural nature of geometry nodes and adds more to manage, so I prefer not to take that route. The node group we'll be making will allow you to change pivot points on the fly. I believe this is a better and cleaner option. Just see how easy it is. Second issue. We lack the baseline center option for pivot point. You'll most likely notice this when you scale text with letters such as this P or Y. None of these pivot point options result in a clean, appealing scale animation. If we choose bottom center, we end up with all letters out of placement when animation starts. Matter of fact, no pivot point option results in a clean scaling animation. We end up with better result without the usage of pivot points, but the X spacing is not uniform and leaves more to be desired. The optimal solution in this case is what I call a zero center pivot point. As you can see, the scaling animation is very clean. This pivot point combines baseline position for Y and letter center position for X. The difference is pretty stark when we set them side by side. So, let's tackle these issues by building a custom node group. As soon as we enter Blender, let's hop right into Geometry Nodes layout. A to select all, X to delete. Shift A, add a mesh plane. Using numpad 7 and 5, go into top orthographic view. New to create a new map. Delete group input, and replace it with string input. We'll start with a small case P, pass it through strings to curve, and output. Here is the starting point. Let's go ahead and branch out a realized instance. Then, connect the bounding box. Make sure to turn off this use radius option. We'll join the bounding box and strings to curve for output. I'm going to switch to wireframe for a little explanation. So, what I'm going to be doing is storing all the pivot points of interest as attributes. Blender provides 7 pivot points as built-in option. 3 points along the bottom, bottom left, bottom center, bottom right. Midpoint in the center. 3 points along the top, top left, top center, and top right. I'll be adding 5 more points on top of them. Middle left, middle right. And 3 along the baseline. 0 left, 0 center, and 0 right. Might be an overkill, but we'll end up with 12 selectable points. Let's go ahead and define the acronyms as well. In Y direction, we'll have B for bottom, M for middle, T for top, and Z for 0. In X direction, L for left, C for center, R for right. So, this point will be MR using this convention. With that in mind, let's get going. Start off by deleting this joint geometry and display the original text curve. Then, connect separate XYZ from the bounding box min and max. Also, vector mass add min and max. Then, scale by 0.5 to get the center point. We'll connect the separate XYZ to this result as well. We now have 3 XYZ coordinates to mix and match. Let's start with the bottom left point. First, add a store named attribute and set to vector instance. Name it pivot BL. We'll connect the geometry sockets later. Next, combine the x and y of min for the bottom left coordinate. We want to turn this coordinate to local coordinate just as in built-in pivot points. So, insert a position node and vector mass subtract it from the combine. Then, store the result as a named attribute. Each attribute calculation will follow this pattern. We need 12 of these, so let's stack these vertically for more real estate. Next point is bottom center. I'm going to full view the node map so we can see better. Duplicate these nodes with connection using Ctrl-Shift-D. Move them right. Rename to pivot BC. Then, reconnect the mid X as new X. Next, bottom right. Duplicate as before and rename to pivot BR. Reconnect the max X as a new X. We'll deal with the noodle chaos later, so let's just keep going. Next, middle Y coordinates. Duplicate all these with connections and move them right. Rename them pivot ML, pivot MC, pivot MR. Reconnect mid Y as their Y. Moving to the top, you know the deal, duplicate. Rename to pivot TL, pivot TC, pivot TR. Connect max Y as Y. Now we have bottom, middle, and top pivot points. Lastly, we'll do the baseline 0. Duplicate as before and rename. Pivot ZL, pivot ZC, pivot ZR. For this, we don't want the wide coordinates, so cut these connections. We want to constrain the resulting vector to x. So create some space above the subtract, and insert a vector mass multiply. Multiply the subtract result with 1, 0, 0, and just keep the x result. All the pivot points have been saved, so we'll connect the geometry line. And do not forget to connect the group output at the end. I'm going to clean up the noodles to make it easier for you to check the connections. I'll just fast forward this part. Let's verify we got all the connections right. Easiest way to do this is by inserting a scale instance with value of 0.1. This should shift the shrunken text to its pivot point. We can connect the named attribute to check each pivot point. I'll just go in listed order. If you find a mismatch between the attribute name and text position, you most likely made a connection error. Mine seems to be working correctly, so I'll move on. We are done with one letter, but we have to repeat this for all letters in the string. Add a for each element node and change the main to instance. Place the input side after strings to curve, and output side after the last stored named attribute. Don't forget to connect the bottom socket to the output. Let's just try entering multiple letters. As you can see, all letters are following their individual selected pivot points. Alright, so pivot point calculation is done. So let's grab all the nodes within for each element and group them. Tab out and call it Calc Pivot Points. Let's reorganize a bit. We now have an ability to set the pivot point by switching the attribute name. However, we can easily get lost trying to find the pivot point name from the list of all attributes. So, let's make a utility node group to select the desired pivot point from dropdown, just like the built-in one. Turn this named attribute into a group. Open up the side panel with N, and delete all ins and outs except for attribute output. Then, add a menu switch and change type to string. Select the Node tab and increase the menu item count to 12. 2 already exists, so 10 more items. We will rename them to easily recognizable names. From the top, bottom left, bottom center, bottom right, so forth. I'll just fast forward this part as well. Now that we have 12 inputs renamed, we'll set the attribute name in the empty node fields. Connect the menu switch to group input and named attribute, and we are done. Tab out and call this set pivot point. Now we can easily select pivot points without having to go through all the attributes. The node groups are complete, but a word of caution. Unlike the built-in version, this repeated calculation requires a bit of processing load. If you intend to use long text, you might experience some lag on the frame rate. I suggest using a bake node if you're adamant about shaving off some load. If you want to use these node groups in other files, I suggest registering them as assets. You can right-click on this shield icon and select Mark as Asset to do so. If you save this file under a file path set as Asset Library, you will be able to instance them in any other Blend file. Okay, let's go over the node we made. This is an overview of Calc pivot points. And here's a close-up from the left. Set pivot point node group. This node group won't work by itself, so make sure to do Calc pivot points before using this. As I stated in the beginning, I made this function to improve my workflow when making simple text animations. It might not be something you need at the moment. That being said, you might encounter pivot point issues I mentioned in the beginning down the road. So, it might be a good idea to have these nodes in your toolbox to deal with such circumstance. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.